5 terrifying cases where human phobias became deadly reality. There exists a threshold in human consciousness where rational fear transforms into something far more dangerous than psychological distress, where the electrical patterns of extreme phobic terror create frequencies that somehow bridge the gap between what exists in our minds and what can manifest in physical reality. Most psychologists dismiss phobias as irrational anxieties, chemical imbalances that can be treated with therapy and medication. But buried within psychiatric case files and emergency response reports lies evidence of something that challenges everything we think we understand about the relationship between human fear and the physical laws governing our world. These aren't stories about people overcoming their fears or learning to manage anxiety through treatment and support. These are documented cases where phobic terror reached such intensity that it began operating according to rules that exceed normal psychological boundaries, where the things people feared most didn't just feel real, they became real. Because human consciousness, when driven to extremes of terror and desperation, apparently possesses capabilities that psychiatric textbooks refuse to acknowledge. Capabilities that can reach across the barrier between thought and matter, between internal anxiety and external manifestation, between what we imagine and what can actually kill us. The people in these files didn't die from heart attacks or panic responses to their phobic triggers. They died from direct physical contact with the impossible manifestations of their own deepest fears. Manifestations that left behind evidence, witnesses, and forensic reports that no rational framework can explain. If you really like what we are doing here, please press that like button. Even a comment will help the channel by pushing the algorithm to show your favorite channel to others. And this helps us to summon more horror stories every single night. Number 5. The vertigo incident. Dr. Heather Reynolds had treated hundreds of acrophobia patients during her 15 years as a behavioral therapist before she encountered Daniel Corbett, a case that would end her career and leave her afraid to climb even a single flight of stairs for the rest of her life. Corbett suffered from acrophobia so severe that he couldn't stand on chairs, look out second-story windows, or even watch movies with aerial photography without experiencing panic attacks that required emergency medical intervention. His fear of heights had cost him multiple jobs, relationships, and opportunities, confining him to a ground-level existence that avoided any elevation above 6 feet. Reynolds initially treated Corbett's case as extreme but manageable acrophobia, using traditional exposure therapy and anxiety management techniques. But during their third session, she noticed something that didn't match any psychological pattern she had studied. Corbett's panic responses occurred even when his eyes were closed and he had no visual awareness of being at height. More disturbing were the gravitational anomalies that began manifesting during Corbett's panic episodes. Reynolds' office was located on the building's second floor, but when Corbett experienced severe acrophobia attacks during their meetings, both therapist and patient could feel the floor tilting beneath them, as if the entire room was rotating toward a precipice that didn't exist in normal architectural space. The attacks escalated beyond anything Reynolds had encountered in psychiatric literature. During one session, Corbett described feeling the pull, even while sitting in her ground floor waiting room. He could sense vast vertical drops opening beneath him, abyssal depths that seemed to extend infinitely downward, despite the solid concrete foundation visible through basement access doors. Reynolds arranged for Corbett to undergo psychological evaluation in a controlled clinical environment, but the results challenged everything she thought she understood about the relationship between phobic anxiety and physical reality. EEG monitoring during Corbett's acrophobia episodes showed brain activity patterns that resembled vertigo responses in people actually falling from dangerous heights. But the most disturbing discovery occurred during Corbett's final therapy session. As his panic attack reached maximum intensity, Reynolds watched her patient begin sliding across the floor toward the window. Despite the complete absence of any slope, vibration, or gravitational force that could account for his movement, Corbett was being pulled toward the glass by acceleration that violated every law of physics. Reynolds grabbed Corbett's arm to prevent him from reaching the window, but the pulling force was so strong that both therapist and patient were dragged across the room together. When Corbett's terror reached absolute peak intensity, the window glass didn't shatter. It simply vanished, leaving an opening that revealed not the parking lot outside, but an endless vertical shaft extending both upward and downward beyond the limits of visibility. Corbett fell through the impossible opening despite being on the second floor of a building, with solid ground directly beneath his window. Reynolds watched him plummet through dimensional space that couldn't exist, but was somehow overlapping with her therapy office. His screams faded into distances that exceeded any possible building height. Emergency responders found Corbett's body 18 miles away, in a forest where no tall structures existed, but his injuries were consistent with a fall from extreme altitude. The coroner's report estimated a drop of several thousand feet, despite the absence of any elevated location in the region that could account for such trauma. Reynolds discovered that Corbett's medical history included multiple accidents involving unexplained falls from ground-level positions. Family members described incidents where he would simply disappear through solid floors, vanishing into basements that weren't there moments before, only to be found in sub-basement areas that building blueprints confirmed didn't exist. According to Reynolds' suppressed case notes, Corbett's acrophobia hadn't been fear of existing heights. It had been accurate perception of gravitational anomalies that followed him constantly, dimensional instabilities that turned any location into potential falling hazards that existed in parallel space overlapping with normal reality. Reynolds closed her practice and moved to a single-story house in a completely flat region, because her research suggested that extreme acrophobia might be an unconscious ability to detect areas where gravitational fields operated according to rules that physics couldn't explain. And once someone with this sensitivity experienced a genuine dimensional fall, the anomalies would begin manifesting around anyone who tried to help them, spreading like an infection that turned solid ground into potential void space. Corbett's acrophobia had been protecting him from something that was always there, waiting beneath the surface of normal reality. And when his fear finally became overwhelming enough to breach the barrier between dimensions, he discovered that his deepest terror had been completely justified all along. Number 4. The serpent's manifestation. Herpetologist Dr. James Whitmore thought he understood the behavioral patterns of both snakes and snake phobics until he investigated the case of Linda Morrison, a woman whose ophidiophobia was so severe that it apparently began attracting actual serpents through methods that exceeded any known biological behavior. Morrison's fear of snakes had started in childhood and intensified throughout her adult life until she couldn't tolerate images, videos, or even verbal descriptions of serpents without experiencing physical symptoms that included rapid heartbeat, cold sweats, and temporary paralysis. She lived in urban environments specifically to avoid any possibility of snake encounters. Whitmore initially dismissed Morrison's claims that snakes were appearing in her apartment, despite living on the 14th floor of a downtown building, in a region with no native snake populations. But when he visited her residence to document what he assumed would be misidentified insects or small lizards, he discovered something that challenged his understanding of snake behavior and urban wildlife ecology. Morrison's apartment contained over a dozen live snakes representing species that shouldn't exist in the city, shouldn't survive in indoor environments, and shouldn't demonstrate the behavioral patterns he observed during his investigation. The serpents weren't randomly distributed but arranged in precise geometric formations around Morrison's living space, as if conducting organized surveillance of her daily activities. More disturbing was how the snakes had entered her residence. Building management confirmed that doors, windows, and ventilation systems were properly sealed, with no access points large enough for snake entry. The serpents appeared to be materializing inside the apartment through methods that exceeded normal animal movement capabilities. The snakes displayed intelligence levels that Whitmore had never encountered in 30 years of herpetological research. They could open cabinets, navigate complex pathways through furniture configurations, and demonstrate problem-solving abilities that suggested cognitive development far exceeding normal reptilian brain capacity. They were hunting Morrison with strategic coordination that resembled military precision. When Whitmore attempted to remove the snakes for relocation to appropriate wildlife facilities, he discovered that traditional capture methods were completely ineffective. The serpents could avoid nets, traps, and containment systems through movement patterns that appeared to violate physical constraints on reptilian locomotion, as if they possessed awareness of capture techniques that exceeded normal animal learning. But the most terrifying discovery occurred when Morrison's ophidiophobia reached maximum intensity during Whitmore's documentation visit. as her panic escalated, additional snakes began manifesting inside the apartment in real time, not entering through any visible access point but simply appearing wherever her terror focused most intensely. Whitmore watched new serpents fade into existence like living mirages, their bodies becoming solid through a materialization process that started with faint outlines and gradually developed into fully formed, biologically active creatures. Morrison's fear wasn't attracting existing snakes. It was creating new ones through psychological processes that transformed phobic imagery into living manifestations. The fabricated serpents possessed complete biological authenticity, with functional cardiovascular systems, digestive organs, and neurological structures that worked according to normal reptilian physiology. They weren't illusions or temporary manifestations, but permanent additions to reality that would continue existing independently even after Morrison's panic attack subsided. Morrison's case file revealed a pattern of snake encounters that had been escalating in frequency and intensity throughout her adult life. Family members described incidents where she would find serpents in impossible locations, inside sealed containers, within appliances, emerging from solid walls, always in quantities that exceeded any natural explanation for urban snake presence. Whitmore realized that Morrison's ophidiophobia had evolved beyond psychological fear into a form of biological summoning that drew serpent consciousness from dimensions parallel to normal reality. Her terror created bridges between worlds where snake intelligence operated according to different rules, allowing them to manifest in her physical environment as fully functional biological entities. According to Whitmore's classified research, Morrison's condition represented an extreme form of phobia-based manifestation, where human fear becomes sufficiently intense to breach dimensional barriers and import actual living creatures from parallel biological systems. Her apartment had become a permanent gateway that continued producing new snakes even after her disappearance. Morrison was found dead in her bathroom, not from snake venom or physical trauma, but from what the coroner described as biological integration failure. Her autopsy revealed that her circulatory system had been replaced with serpentine structures. Her bones had developed snake-like flexibility, and her skin showed patterns of scale development. She had been transforming into the creatures she feared most. The manifestation process worked both ways. Morrison's terror created snakes, but prolonged exposure to manifested serpent consciousness had begun converting her biology toward reptilian characteristics, as if the dimensional bridge she had opened allowed traffic in both directions. Fear creates what it fears most, but it also becomes what it creates. Number 3. The absence of light. Paranormal investigator Dr. Sophia Blackwell had studied dozens of cases involving unexplained darkness phenomena before she encountered Marcus Chen, a nightophobia sufferer whose fear of darkness was so extreme that it began consuming light sources around him, creating zones of absolute darkness that violated the physical laws governing illumination and shadow. Chen's nyctophobia had developed during childhood and intensified throughout his adult life until he required multiple light sources in every room, slept only under maximum illumination, and experienced panic attacks when cloud cover reduced natural daylight below a certain threshold. He lived in constant fear that darkness would somehow gain consciousness and begin hunting him specifically. Blackwell initially approached Chen's case as an extreme but treatable phobic condition that could be managed through gradual exposure therapy and anxiety reduction techniques, but when she visited his residence to assess his lighting arrangements, she discovered something that challenged her understanding of how darkness and illumination function in normal physical space. Chen's apartment contained industrial lighting systems that should have eliminated shadows completely, but certain areas maintained absolute darkness despite being surrounded by high-intensity illumination. These dark zones weren't caused by blocked light sources or architectural obstructions. They were patches of darkness that existed independently of any logical shadow-casting mechanism. More disturbing was how the dark zones moved throughout Chen's living space with apparent intelligence, always positioning themselves just beyond his direct vision while maintaining constant proximity to his location. Blackwell observed the darkness actively avoiding direct illumination, not dispersing when lights were focused on it, but relocating to maintain its integrity and strategic position. The darkness demonstrated awareness of Chen's emotional state and psychological vulnerability. During panic episodes, the dark zones would expand rapidly, absorbing light from multiple sources simultaneously until entire rooms became enveloped in blackness that seemed to possess density and weight exceeding normal shadow characteristics. When Blackwell attempted to document the phenomena using standard electromagnetic equipment, her instruments detected unusual energy patterns within the dark zones that resembled consciousness signatures rather than simple absence of illumination. The darkness was alive, aware, and actively malevolent toward Chen specifically. But the most horrifying discovery occurred when Chen's acrophobia reached maximum intensity during Blackwell's investigation. The expanding darkness didn't just absorb light from electrical sources, it began consuming illumination from sources that should have been impossible to extinguish, including digital displays, LED indicators, and even the phosphorescent glow from emergency exit signs. The darkness could devour photons faster than they could be produced, creating light-proof zones that remained black, even under direct exposure to multiple high-powered illumination systems. It wasn't blocking light or reflecting it away from Chen's environment. It was destroying the fundamental particles that create illumination, eliminating them from local spacetime through methods that exceeded known physics. Chen's panic attacks triggered dimensional instabilities that allowed the darkness to expand beyond his immediate environment. Blackwell watched the light-consuming zones spread throughout his apartment building, affecting neighboring units and creating areas of absolute blackness that persisted even after Chen's emotional state stabilized. Emergency power systems failed to provide illumination within the affected zones. Flashlights, candles, chemical light sources, and even burning materials produced no visible illumination when brought into contact with the expanded darkness. The dark zones had become areas where the fundamental relationship between energy and light emission had been permanently altered. Blackwell discovered that Chen's medical history included multiple incidents involving unexplained power failures, equipment malfunctions, and lighting system breakdowns that occurred whenever his nyctophobia intensified beyond normal phobic levels. His fear wasn't just psychological terror, it was accurately detecting the presence of living darkness that fed on illumination and grew stronger through contact with human terror. According to Blackwell's suppressed case files, Chen's condition represented an extreme form of nyctophobia, where prolonged terror of darkness created dimensional weak points that allowed anti-light entities to manifest in normal reality. His fear had opened a gateway for beings that existed in dimensional space, where illumination was food that could be consumed, digested, and converted into expanded territory for further colonization. Chen was found dead in his apartment during what appeared to be a city-wide power failure that affected only his building. The electrical grid showed no malfunctions, but his residence had become a light-proof zone that existed in permanent darkness, regardless of external illumination. His body showed signs of prolonged light deprivation, but also characteristics that suggested he had been absorbed into the darkness, rather than simply dying from fear or shock. The darkness that consumed Chen's apartment became a permanent feature that continues affecting the building's lighting systems. Tenants report areas of impossible shadow that move independently through their living spaces, growing stronger during periods of high occupancy stress, and eventually driving residents to relocate through psychological pressure that accumulates over time. Chen's nyctophobia had been protecting him from something that was always there, waiting in the spaces between photons for sufficient fear to create anchor points in normal reality. And once the darkness gained access to physical space through his terror, it discovered that illuminated worlds contained far more energy sources than its original dimensional environment could provide. Number 2. The Eternal Grin. Child psychologist Dr. Michael Torres had treated numerous coulrophobia cases during his career, understanding the condition as an understandable fear response to the uncanny valley effect created by clown makeup and exaggerated facial expressions, until he investigated the case of Rebecca Walsh, whose terror of clowns was so intense that it began manifesting actual clown entities that operated according to nightmare logic rather than normal entertainment industry standards. Walsh's coulrophobia had developed during early childhood and intensified throughout her adult life, until she couldn't tolerate any image, reference, or even mention of clowns, without experiencing severe panic attacks that required medical intervention. She lived in constant vigilance against unexpected clown encounters that might trigger psychological episodes severe enough to require hospitalization. Torres initially approached Walsh's case using standard exposure therapy techniques designed to gradually reduce her phobic response through controlled encounters with clown imagery and eventually live clown performers. But when he arranged for a therapeutic session involving a professional children's entertainer, he discovered something that challenged his understanding of how phobias manifest in physical space. During the planned exposure session, Walsh began describing clown encounters that weren't occurring anywhere in the clinical environment. She provided detailed descriptions of multiple clown figures surrounding her, despite the therapy room containing only Torres and a single professional entertainer wearing minimal makeup and non-threatening costume elements. More disturbing was how Walsh's descriptions proved accurate when Torres checked building security footage. The recordings showed additional figures in elaborate clown costumes appearing throughout the clinical facility. Figures that hadn't been present during the actual session but were somehow captured on surveillance systems, as if they existed in parallel space overlapping with normal reality. The manifested clown entities demonstrated behavioral patterns that exceeded normal human performance capabilities. Security footage revealed figures moving through solid walls, appearing simultaneously in multiple locations, and displaying facial expressions that changed independently of any makeup or costume adjustments, as if their features were genuine rather than artificial enhancements. When Torres attempted to modify the exposure therapy approach, he discovered that Walsh's coulrophobia was attracting increasingly sophisticated clown manifestations, regardless of whether actual clown performers were present. The entities would appear wherever her terror reached sufficient intensity, materializing in her workplace, home environment, and even during routine medical appointments. But the most horrifying development occurred when Walsh's panic episodes began affecting other people in her vicinity. Torres observed colleagues and family members developing coulrophobia symptoms after spending time around Walsh during her severe anxiety attacks, as if her terror was somehow contagious and could spread to create additional anchor points for clown entity manifestation. The secondary coulrophobia victims described identical clown encounters involving the same specific entities that Walsh had been reporting for months. Multiple independent witnesses provided matching descriptions of particular clown figures, including details about costume design, facial features, and behavioral characteristics that suggested shared contact with actual beings rather than mass hallucination or psychological suggestion. Torres documented escalating manifestation events where clown entities demonstrated increasingly malevolent intentions toward Walsh and her expanded circle of affected individuals. The beings displayed knowledge about their victims' personal fears, family relationships, and psychological vulnerabilities that they use for systematic psychological torture designed to maximize terror production. The clown manifestations weren't random supernatural phenomena, but organized psychological warfare conducted by entities that understood human fear responses and were using Walsh's coulrophobia as a dimensional gateway to access broader human populations. Her terror created the initial bridge, but the entities were expanding their operational territory through strategic fear cultivation in additional victims. Torres realized that Walsh's coulrophobia had evolved beyond psychological phobia into a form of interdimensional recruitment that allowed malevolent entities to establish permanent presence in normal reality by exploiting human fear of the uncanny valley effect. The clown appearance was camouflage that allowed them to operate openly within human communities while being dismissed as entertainment industry performers. According to Torres' classified case files, Walsh's condition represented an extreme form of phobia-based manifestation, where human terror creates permanent gateways for entities that exist in dimensional space, where psychological fear serves as food and territorial expansion opportunity. Her coulrophobia had been protecting her from something that was always hunting for access points into human civilization. Walsh disappeared during a therapy session that was being conducted in a secure clinical facility, with multiple security systems and professional staff providing constant supervision. Security footage shows her walking into a therapy room alone, but the recordings also show dozens of clown figures following her through the facility's corridors. Figures that cast no shadows and left no physical traces but were somehow interacting with the environment around Walsh. The last footage shows Walsh surrounded by manifested clown entities in an empty therapy room, but instead of appearing terrified, she was laughing. Her facial expressions had developed the exaggerated characteristics of clown makeup, and her movements had acquired the mechanical precision of professional entertainment performance. She had become the thing she feared most. The manifested clown entities continue appearing throughout the city where Walsh lived, but they no longer target coulrophobia sufferers exclusively. They've learned to trigger coulrophobia in normal individuals through strategic psychological manipulation, expanding their operational territory by creating new phobic victims who provide additional dimensional anchor points for continued manifestation and territorial expansion. Number 1. The Walls Forever. Architectural psychologist Dr. Laura Vance spent her career studying how enclosed spaces affect human consciousness before she investigated the case of Thomas Reed, whose claustrophobia was so severe that it began altering the physical dimensions of spaces around him, creating impossible architectural configurations that trapped victims in areas that couldn't exist according to normal engineering principles. Reed's claustrophobia had manifested during adolescence and intensified throughout his adult life, until he couldn't enter elevators, small rooms, or even moderately confined spaces without experiencing panic attacks that included symptoms of oxygen deprivation and pressure sensitivity that exceeded normal psychological anxiety responses. Vance initially treated Reed's condition using traditional claustrophobia therapy techniques designed to gradually increase his tolerance for enclosed environments through controlled exposure and relaxation training. But when she attempted to conduct sessions in her standard clinical facility, she discovered that Reed's presence somehow affected the architectural characteristics of the building itself. During Reed's panic episodes, the therapy room appeared to shrink physically rather than simply feeling smaller due to psychological perception distortion. Vance could measure actual reductions in ceiling height, wall spacing, and floor area that occurred in real time as Reed's anxiety intensified, as if his claustrophobia was somehow compressing the physical dimensions of surrounding space. More disturbing was how the architectural changes persisted after Reed's panic attack subsided. The therapy room remained permanently smaller than its original dimensions, with structural modifications that building inspections confirmed violated the facility's blueprints and engineering specifications. Reed's terror was creating lasting physical alterations to architectural space. The dimensional compression effects escalated beyond Reed's immediate environment. Vance documented incidents where Reed's claustrophobia episodes affected entire building sections, creating corridor narrowing, ceiling lowering, and room volume reduction that trapped other occupants in spaces that became progressively smaller until emergency evacuation was required. When Vance attempted to study Reed's condition in controlled environments, designed to accommodate his claustrophobic responses, she discovered that traditional architectural measurements became unreliable in his presence. Rooms measured with standard tools showed different dimensions when Reed was experiencing anxiety, as if space itself was responding to his psychological state through mechanisms that exceeded known physics. But the most terrifying discovery occurred when Reed's claustrophobia reached absolute peak intensity during Vance's final assessment session. The architectural compression didn't just make spaces smaller, it began eliminating spatial dimensions entirely, creating areas where three-dimensional space folded into configurations that couldn't support human existence. Vance watched Reed disappear into walls that weren't moving toward him, but were somehow occupying the same spatial coordinates where he had been standing. The compression effect had reached a threshold where physical dimensions collapsed completely, creating impossible architectural conditions where walls, floors, and ceilings existed in the same location simultaneously. Emergency responders found Reed embedded within the building's structural elements, not crushed between surfaces, but integrated into wall and floor materials as if he had been absorbed into the architectural matrix during dimensional collapse. His body remained intact but existed within concrete and steel structures that couldn't have accommodated human presence during normal construction. Reed's medical history revealed multiple incidents involving unexplained entrapment, in spaces that building records confirmed should have allowed easy exit access. Family members described episodes where he would become stuck in rooms, elevators, and vehicles through architectural failures that investigation teams couldn't explain using conventional engineering analysis. Vance realized that Reed's claustrophobia hadn't been irrational psychological fear, but accurate perception of dimensional instabilities that followed him throughout his life, creating architectural hazards that materialized whenever his terror reached sufficient intensity to trigger spatial collapse events. His fear had been protecting him from something that was always there, waiting to compress physical space into configurations that would eliminate his existence. According to Vance's suppressed research, Reed's condition represented an extreme form of claustrophobia, where human terror of confined spaces creates dimensional weak points that allow gravitational and spatial anomalies to manifest in normal architectural environments. His claustrophobia had been an early warning system, detecting areas where three-dimensional space operated according to rules that physics couldn't explain. The building where Reed disappeared became structurally unsafe for human occupancy due to persistent dimensional instabilities that continue affecting spatial relationships throughout the facility. Rooms change size without architectural modification. Corridors lead to spaces that blueprints confirm don't exist, and structural elements appear in locations that violate the building's original engineering specifications. But the most disturbing legacy of Reed's case is how his dimensional compression effects appear to be spreading to other claustrophobia sufferers throughout the region. Vance documented multiple reports of architectural anomalies affecting individuals with moderate claustrophobia symptoms, suggesting that Reed's extreme manifestation created a dimensional cascade effect that continues expanding through psychological contact with affected populations. Reed's claustrophobia had opened a gateway between normal space and dimensions, where architectural rules operate according to different principles, allowing spatial anomalies to establish permanent presence in human-built environments. His fear created bridges that remain active, continuing to trap people in architectural impossibilities that shouldn't exist but feel completely real to anyone unfortunate enough to experience them. These 5 cases represent more than extreme psychological manifestations of common human fears. They reveal that phobias might be humanity's most accurate defense mechanism against threats that exist in dimensional space parallel to normal reality. Early warning systems that detect dangers our conscious minds can't comprehend. Acrophobia detects gravitational anomalies and dimensional voids that can manifest as genuine falling hazards, regardless of apparent ground stability. Ophidiophobia recognizes the presence of serpentine consciousness that exists in parallel biological systems and can manifest as fully functional living creatures. Nyctophobia identifies anti-light entities that consume illumination and expand their territory through contact with human terror. Coulrophobia reveals malevolent beings that use uncanny valley effects as camouflage while establishing permanent presence in human communities. And claustrophobia warns against dimensional compression zones, where architectural space can collapse into configurations that eliminate human existence. What psychological literature dismisses as irrational fear responses are actually sophisticated threat detection systems that perceived dangers our scientific understanding isn't advanced enough to recognize. These phobias weren't psychological disorders requiring treatment. They were survival mechanisms protecting their victims from genuine supernatural threats that become accessible to manifestation whenever human terror reaches sufficient intensity to create dimensional weak points. But the most disturbing truth about these phobia manifestation cases isn't what they reveal about the relationship between fear and reality. It's what they suggest about the purpose of therapy and psychological treatment designed to eliminate phobic responses. Every successful phobia treatment potentially removes a protective barrier that prevents dangerous entities from establishing permanent presence in normal reality. Modern psychology treats intense fears as disorders to be cured, but these cases prove that phobic terror might be humanity's last defense against threats that view our dimensional space as unexplored territory, ripe for colonization and expansion. The people who overcome their phobias through therapeutic intervention might be unknowingly removing the only warning systems that detect approaching supernatural predators. These entities exist in dimensional space that overlaps with human reality, but they require anchor points created by extreme human fear to establish permanent presence in our world. Phobias serve as early detection systems that identify areas where dimensional barriers become thin enough for manifestation events. But successful treatment eliminates the psychological vigilance needed to recognize and avoid these dangerous zones. The manifestation process works both ways. Human fear creates gateways for supernatural entities, but it also provides the psychological energy needed to maintain dimensional barriers that keep more dangerous beings confined to parallel space. When phobia sufferers overcome their fears through treatment, they might be inadvertently weakening protective barriers that prevent large-scale supernatural colonization of human reality. And somewhere in the hidden case files of psychological treatment facilities, therapists continue curing patients of fears that were protecting not just individual victims, but entire human communities from threats that gain strength through every successful phobia elimination. Modern therapy isn't healing psychological disorders. It's systematically removing humanity's supernatural defense systems, one patient at a time. The fears we cure might be the only thing standing between human civilization and entities that view psychological terror as an invitation for permanent colonization of our dimensional space. And when enough protective phobias have been eliminated through therapeutic intervention, these beings will discover that human reality offers far more resources than their original dimensions could provide. Fear isn't malfunction, it's protection. And the day we stop being afraid might be the day we leave ourselves completely defenseless against things that have been waiting centuries for humanity to voluntarily remove its own supernatural security systems. The phobias aren't destroying us. They're the only reason we're still here. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this dark journey, hit the like button and subscribe. New horror documentaries every single night here on TrumbleDreams.